This episode is brought to you by Hasa. Liquid is clearly better. Liquid chlorine is the highest purity, works immediately, has no added cyanuric acid or calcium, and it will leave your pool safe, clean, and clear. And by the Bottom Feeder professional grade battery powered vacuum system. It sucks to clean pools, so cleaning pools sucks less. Get $100 off with code DVB100.
This episode is brought to you by Skimmer, the #1 pool service software in North America. With Skimmer, you can streamline your schedule, grow your revenue, and keep your customers coming back with 5-star service. Whether you're a one-person operation or an established team, Skimmer is your partner in success. Visit getskimmer.com/poolguy to try Skimmer for free for 30 days.
The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show.
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to talk to you about some different things with Plaster. I'm not going to say defects, but there are some things that may look like defects, and they may be defects as well. But Plaster is interesting. Pool surfaces are very interesting, and a lot can happen to affect the look of it, whether it's caused by chemicals or by the initial build. I'll go over some things here for you. Are you a pool service pro looking to take your business to the next level? Join the Pool Guy coaching program. Get expert advice, business tips, exclusive content, and get direct support from me. I'm a 35-year veteran in the industry. Whether you're starting out or scaling up, I've got the tools to help you succeed. Learn more at swimmingpoollearning.com. I know a lot of pool pros worry about plaster problems and being blamed for them. And this does happen out there when you take over a pool. There's maybe a discoloration in the plaster. The first person they're going to turn towards is you because you're servicing the pool. You're kind of holding the bag. And it could be 6 months down the road or 1 year from the build. And all eyes are turned on you, unfortunately, because you're the one kind of driving the vehicle. It's kind of like if you went back to the dealer after a year and say, hey man, this car has these, all these problems. And the first thing they're going to think is, well, it's not the car, it's the driver of the car. How do you drive the car? You're maintaining it. And that's why everyone looks at you as a pool service professional as the person who is in charge of the plaster or the surface of the pool if it's not plaster. And if there's a problem, you're first in line to take the heat. Now, I know that it's logical to tell the customer this, and I've used this before many times. I'll tell the customer, look, I've been doing this for a long time and I have a lot of pools in the area and I haven't had this problem. And if I was maintaining the pool poorly, if it was my fault, then 20 of the pools on my route would look just like yours. And unfortunately, only your pool has this problem. And if you want, I can give you addresses of pools to look at that were built similar time to yours. Hopefully you have some kind of newer builds on your route. And you can just direct them over there to see those pools. And usually the customer that you're servicing will have no problem. Just explain to them that you have a customer that has a problem with their pool. They want to see their pool or the other customer's pool that you're talking to kind of compare and contrast, and they'll be perfectly fine with that. Everyone loves showing their pool off to other people. And that's kind of how I logically explain to them that if it was me, every single pool would look like that or have that problem. Now, hopefully it's not a problem where it gets to that level to where you have to send the customer looking at other pools or where, you're threatened by lawsuits or, other things at that high level, which it can escalate to that point. I've had a pool or a couple pools where it got to the point where the customer is like, oh, I'm going to sue your company or whatever. And it's one of those things like I actually had a friend who actually sued the builder. And this was many, many years ago. He had a pool built by this builder and it had these discoloration streaks in it. It was a color plaster pool. And if you have a color plaster pool, if you take care of one, you know that they're going to have a lot of discoloration. But these were kind of weird. They showed me the picture of it. This, again, was several years ago, and it had like these darker streaks down the deep end. I almost looked like, for some reason, when they filled the pool, somehow water, I don't know, from a garden hose or something went down the sides of it before it was filled, but that's unusual. The builder usually will fill it with a towel and a garden hose on the bottom of the deep end, but it did look like some water got on there before it fully cured, and that's why I had those streaks. Well, anyway, he went to court. He actually went as far as to court with it. And the judge looked at the photos and looked at everything, and he's not a builder, he's not a pool professional or anything in that regards. And so that's the danger, or that's the benefit, I guess, when you go to court. The builder, of course, had all the documentation, showed everything wasn't, anything that he did in the build. And the judge didn't have enough evidence to rule in the favor of the pool owner because, the judge is a judge. He has to make a judgment based on the evidence and based on what he sees. And he's not an expert. And to him, that looked just like normal, discoloration of the pool. And it was in my opinion, it was a pretty bad discoloration. And the pattern, again, was kind of like a streak pattern. So obviously there was a problem. But you have to really have a case that's 100% bulletproof. If you went to court and there's like big old holes in the plaster, 2 feet holes cracked everywhere, then yes, you do have a case there. There was actually another case where I know a builder here in Los Angeles, he built an infinity edge pool and it started actually sinking, which a lot of them do sink, by the way, but this one was sinking more than like anything you would ever see before. And I think it was sinking like 1 or 2 feet. It was like a crazy amount, it was cracking. Of course, the builder lost that lawsuit and he had to pay $250,000, or insurance had to pay that to redo the pool. And it was just bad engineering at that point. It wasn't the builder's fault, but it was the engineer he hired, and the hillside could not sustain that pool. Anyway, I just want to let you know that unless there's something really obvious your fault, like if you pour 2 gallons of acid in the pool and, you run the pool and it just totally destroys the plaster, it's really hard to go that far all the way to court, and most people don't go that far to court over, discoloration of the pool surface. So now that I got the scary stuff out of the way, basically there are just a few things that are really defects of the plaster, and the mottling of the plaster, or the discoloration, like the pattern, kind of like a topographical map, is pretty normal in plaster. Much more evident in colored plaster. It's called mottling. Now, I think a lot of times what brings this on, in my opinion, is low alkalinity in the pool and the startup is one thing that really makes the mottling present itself faster than it normally would come out in the plaster. What I like to do when I start up the pool is to keep the alkalinity like right around 100. That way, that eliminates that factor, because I've seen pools I've taken over right after the pool was built, after the startup, where the alkalinity was like 30. And this could happen if they're doing like an acid startup or a hot startup and they never really adjust the alkalinity back up correctly. And I feel like this leads to a lot of the mottling of the plaster. I'm not an expert. You can go to the National Plaster Council, look up articles on it, different articles, but I have seen evidence that low alkalinity does cause this. So as long as you keep the chemicals in range on startup, you should have no problem. My ideal startup would be to run the pool 24/7 for a week, just to keep that thing circulating like crazy. And it seems to be highly effective to do a traditional startup. It's the easiest one to do. You can go to the National Plaster Council website and see the traditional startup, or just Google traditional pool startup. And I really like running it a long time because I feel that really helps everything when the pool is just continuously running. And I've seen pretty good results with pools that are running a lot. Now, a lot of times the mottling will happen because they have a bad startup. I was at a pool where they had finished it, filled it, but the electrician, for whatever reason, was behind, and he actually never wired up the equipment. So it was just sitting there all unwired, unpowered. And so the pool had water for about 10 to 12 days in there with nothing running. That pool did have some serious mottling issues, also had some calcium issues later because of the plaster dust. It was just a big mess. But unless there's a catastrophic failure of subcontractors, typically the mottling will be something that just happens to the plaster over time. In a year or two, you're going to see some slight discolorations. And I always tell people, look at the sidewalk when you're walking. You can see that the cement has discolorations in it. It's just a natural thing when you're using a plaster mix. In fact, a lot of builders won't even warranty white plaster because of the discoloration that can happen in it and the variations of the color of the white plaster. And the Pool Guy Podcast Show has teamed up with UPA to bring you affordable, reliable liability insurance starting at just $64 a month. Get up to $2 million in coverage, and the members of my coaching group get an even lower rate. Protect your business and your peace of mind. Sign up with UPA today by clicking the link in the podcast description. So the normal discoloration or mottling is not a defect in plaster in my opinion. It's just something that naturally occurs in plaster. White spotting is something you're going to hear about. This is when you're going to see white or dark color spots in the plaster. It's called spot etching as well. And this is basically, there's a calcium chloride mix in the plaster. And this really contributes to the plaster being porous at a microscopic level, and then shrinkage and micro cracking of the surface area. So this can happen on a pool build. It's not something that can be controlled usually by anything, but it's something that leads to some kind of, spotting in the pool. You'll see it if you've seen it before, especially with a darker colored plaster pool. You'll see some really light areas of that pool, and that's probably what that is. Discoloration, of course, is something that can happen if you're using colored plaster or even white plaster. And it's like modeling, but there can be some things that, there can be some trowel marks or trowel burns if they're not careful with the surface when they're doing it. And it's one of those things where you can't see some of the marks on there. I had a pool that was built, and you could see a lot of the trowel marks on the steps where they weren't really, I don't know if they were not moving fast enough or they just were kind of sloppy. But it is an art form doing the plaster, by the way, and it is a skilled job, and you can mess it up. I had one pool, and this is one that was the only one I've ever had like this. It was a dark colored plaster mix. They had plastered most of the pool up to about the halfway in the shallow end, and then from halfway in the shallow end to the steps, it's much darker, and you can actually see a line in the pool. And I asked the customer, well, what happened to your pool? He said, well, they ran out of the dye for the plaster, and they had to mix a new batch, which is kind of weird. But, if you're not experienced, that could happen, I guess. And so that's why there's two different colors in the plaster of this pool. Here's one that I've seen also in pool builds here. It's called crazing or cracking. And this is when there's an excessive amount of shrinkage in the surface area. And, dirt and algae will get in there. And it's one of those things where crazing can result from drying the plaster before the pool is filled. And it could also be excessive calcium chloride in the mix. So these are all things that can cause some weird looking patterns on the pool. And I've seen this as well. Again, a lot of these are things you're just going to have to see out there when you're doing the pools. And you have etching also is something that you'll see. Etching in the plaster is, if there's some soft spots or some degrading of it. Usually I've seen this around like return jets before, where you had this problem where it wasn't really done well, and then the return jet has some real looking defect of the plaster. And sometimes it can just be basically the application or the mix of the plaster that causes that. So just understand that you may see trowel marks. I've seen footprints in the pool before myself as well. I've seen this one, and this one is one that can be avoided, but it does happen out there. And that is when the pool is being filled, the customer should never turn the pool water off until it's completely filled all the way to the tile line. It doesn't really matter, I think, the speed of filling. It's just if it does stop for a period of time, let's say 10 hours or so, when the customer did this, they were going to bed, they didn't want to leave the water running, and so about 1.5 feet from the tile line, they turned off the water. Next day, they continued filling it, but what happened is that top area of plaster was exposed, and the line where the water had stopped, when they continued filling it, there was about a 1/2-inch line around the whole entire pool of discoloration from that moment, and it was impossible to get rid of. The builder did a zero alkalinity treatment, and it looked a little lighter, but that line is probably still there till this day because it can't be removed once you do that. So never turn the water off when the pool is filling, even for an hour or two, because that could leave that mark. I was at a pool also where they use the autofill to fill the pool, and from the autofill into the pool, you can see a discoloration where the water ran down the side of the pool into the pool. And of course, you don't want to use the autofill to fill up a new build. You want to make sure you put the garden hose in the bottom in a towel, and that way you're filling it without leaving any marks or mars on the bottom. I've also seen the bottom of the deep end that had kind of like those discolorations all by the main drain. And apparently, I guess the hose was moved a few times and didn't have a towel on there for whatever reason, and it left those marks as well. The plaster, while it's curing, is very malleable. It's kind of like if you were at you were on the sidewalk and they put a new cement slab in and you put your name in there, or you stepped on it. Same thing would happen to the pool plaster in some respects. It's still curing and it's still pretty soft, so anything could cause that kind of problem. I even had a new build where they had a jacaranda tree over it, and it was in the time when it was dropping those little tiny, a millimeter type leaves everywhere, and a bunch of those got into the pool. Now, once the pool plaster cured, most of the staining we were able to remove, but you could still see tiny little leaf marks all through the shallow end of the pool, which never went away. Another one, a dog got into the step area, stepped in there. You can see the dog paws on the plaster. So as it's curing, it's very malleable. One of the most common defects that I see here in my area is calcium nodules. And these are deposits in the plaster. Usually it comes out when, 2 or 3 years after the pool build. So it definitely looks like you're at fault because you've been doing the pool for 2 or 3 years. And you're going to see these kind of raised white marks in the pool, almost like, I don't know, they're just calcium basically deposits, but they look maybe the size of a nickel or a quarter, and they look like something you would see in a cave. They're coming out of the plaster itself, and these bumps are pretty much can form anywhere on the side of the wall or on the bottom. And the problem is that there's small cracks or voids in the plaster, and then the calcium-rich water seeps into these cracks, and then over time, 2 or 3 years, they form in there, and that's where you get the calcium nodules forming in the pool. And that isn't your fault, and it's kind of the builder's fault, but it's been a long time, so it's one of those hard ones to kind of say, hey, the builder, when they were plastering it, there's little pockets in there, and this is where the calcium's forming. Really hard to explain that to the customer. I had one that was really bad where the deep end had like 20 of these, and they were really, really obvious. The best you can do is maybe use a rust stone to kind of scrape it down and make it flush to the surface, but they're going to probably come back over time because there's actually a small little hole in the plaster. I'll end with this defect that I've been getting a lot of messages from Arizona about, and I would assume that maybe in Arizona they got a bad batch of PebbleTech, but PebbleTech is river rock, and if they use a magnet to kind of make sure there's no metals in there when they're manufacturing it. Some of the rocks with metals does get through in certain areas. There was a bad case of this in Hawaii like a decade ago. Here in California, there's been a couple bad cases where a lot of PebbleTech pools built a certain year had this. And you'll see rust stains coming out. It looks like almost like black algae or green algae at first. And then they'll start to get more and more rust color. And they can be the size of a pencil eraser up to the size of a quarter I've seen. And basically that's just the metal and the pebble. The way to cure that is to call PebbleTech. They'll send someone out there and they'll chip those bad pebbles out of the pool. And it's a defect that does pop up ever so often in different areas. And I think right now it's in the Phoenix, Arizona area at this moment. So just keep an eye out for PebbleTech when you see what may look like black algae or green algae. And then over time it starts to get more rust color and looks like a metal stain. It's probably a bad pebble with metal in it. And it's something that can be pretty easily corrected by PebbleTech with their technicians. But I just went over a few of the kind of defects you may see in plaster. And mainly, you're not going to have too much trouble out there. And, the plaster companies are doing the best they can with what they have. And it's one of those things where who's to blame who? And a lot of times, really no one's at fault. It's just the plaster itself curing over time. The discoloration and mottling, to me, are normal for plaster now. And if you really wanted a pool with no discoloration, I would always say go with PebbleTech, but then you're going to get some calcium buildup in there, and it looks like discoloration. So there really isn't a surface type besides vinyl and fiberglass where you're not going to have some kind of discoloration or variation of the plaster or pool surface itself. Looking for other podcasts, you can find those by going to my website, swimmingpoollearning.com. And if you want more podcasts, click on the podcast icon. There'll be a drop-down menu of 1900 podcasts for you there. If you're looking at my coaching program, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. This episode is brought to you by Hasa, providing products that deliver clean, healthy water for every aspect of everyday life. The bottom feeder battery-powered vacuum system, Portable, powerful, and only weighs 12 pounds. And Skimmer. Get Skimmer, America's #1 pool service software. Podcast listeners can try Skimmer for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.